Afternoon, this is Theodore Andrew from Kasigal, Alaska, and you're listening to the Ancient Echoes podcast, the show that tells facts from history for people who love to hear about history today. Today we're talking about the beginning of World War II with Rena Isaac. In a bit, we're gonna bring you back to 1939. Back when World War II started, the war included about 50 freaking nations. This was the deadliest and most humongous war in human history. The war was fought in every direction you looked at. It didn't matter if you were in the air, on land, or on the sea. They were fighting everywhere. And you may wonder what made the war start. So let's sit back on our chairs and talk about it. Rena, can you tell us the conditions when the war began?
We should begin with Germany. After the nation's defeat in World War I, many Germans refused to give up. Although the German economy had been damaged by years of Allied siege, and the civilian population was on the point of starvation, there was never an important battle for Germany, in which the Allies advanced far into the empire. The Allies did not, as we now say, put boots on the ground to demonstrate the German stupidity of their militaristic tactics. Many Germans actually directed their resentment toward revolutionary forces, especially the Jews at home who had overthrown Kaiser Wilhelm II at the end of the war, rather than the Allies for the defeat. Many Germans contended that they were deceived and stabbed in the back, rather than defeated. In fact, a veteran soldier who just had returned from the war and was anxious to take revenge for his death pushed the exact cry to political power. He went by Adolf Hitler, the Treaty of Versailles, for example. The pact drafted by the Allies and imposed the Germany without discussion or chance for update angered the majority of Germans. They rejected what they were viewed as the Allied countries' hypocrisy, as they were more interested in a traditional punishing peace than in pursuing its lofty object of making the world safe for democracy. What did Germany have to give up?
Germany was forced to disarm, give land, and make large reparations to winning nations, effectively paying for the most costly war in history for the following 2 decades. The German economy remained on the edge. The nation experienced uncontrollably high prices in 1923, made a slow comeback in the middle of the 1920s, and then fell into complete economic disaster when the Great Depression struck. Once more, shady politicians like Hitler were prepared to feed the fire as unemployment increased into the 35% range. The Nazi Party was the biggest in Germany by 1932, and he was appointed Chancellor of the German Republic in January 1933. He quickly faked a political attack on the nation to take further power for himself and the Nazis, quickly turning the nation into a dictatorship. Rena, talk about what was the Hoher Laval and how it fit in the Allied policy of appeasement.
Bento was offered most of Ethiopia in exchange for a truce in the Italo-Ethiopian War as part of the 1935 Hoher Laval Pact. It was created by French President Pierre Laval and British Foreign Secretary Sir Samuel Hoare, who attempted and failed to bring France and Italy closer together. The plan was quickly and strongly criticized when word of it leaked out. In the same year when Italy invaded Ethiopia later that year, France and Britain tried to reconcile the action with the need to remain united against Germany, but the coalition soon dissolved, and this is when the Stress Front failed. Now that we talked about their tanks and weapons, Theodore's gonna talk about the Munich Agreement and appeasement.
The appeasement strategy came to an end with the promises made to Poland by Britain and France. Britain's policy of letting Hitler increase German territory unchecked in the 1930s was known as appeasement, and it was implemented in the hopes of preventing war. Now largely lost as a policy of weakness, it is most closely related to British leader Neville Chamberlain. However, it was a well-liked and apparently logical strategy at that time. In May 1935, France and the USSR signed a Treaty of Versailles and mutual support, which Hitler saw as a hostile move against Germany. He used this as an excuse to send German military forces into the Rhineland, the first of many direct violations of the Treaty of Versailles. When Hitler's armies invaded the Rhineland in 1936, Adolf Hitler sent over 20,000 troops back into the Rhineland and remilitarized zone ruled by Germany that bordered France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. This area was crucial for coal, steel, and iron production. In 1935, Hitler took over the Saar region, which was also taken away from Germany to reduce its industrial capability. Great Britain and France did nothing in response, leading Hitler to reoccupy the Rhineland and reunify Germany. This led to Hitler taking over other lands throughout Western Europe. Hitler's invader intentions were made clear when he invaded Austria in March 1938. When the Nazi Germany troops entered Austria and received much support from Austrians against Great Britain, and France did nothing. 2 years later, by allowing Berlin appeared to have prevented war. This agreement became known as the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement was received with joy in Britain. Winston Churchill, who was then cut off from the government and one of the few who opposed Hitler's appeasement, called it an unmitigated disaster. It is the biggest example of appeasement prior to the war. What did the appeasement gain?
Appeasement gained popularity for a number of reasons. The British people, including Chamberlain, were determined to prevent another global conflict. Britain couldn't afford significant preparation since it was burdened with controlling the empire. It had a severely weakened main ally in France, and unlike in the First World War, Commonwealth support was not guaranteed. because they believed that Germany had been treated unfairly after its loss in 1918. Many Britons also felt comfort for the country. Hitler was not discouraged by appeasement, however, even after he pledged to make no territorial demands in Europe. He broke the Munich Agreement in March 1939 by seizing the remaining portion of Czechoslovakia. Britain was at war when Germany invaded Poland 6 months later in September 1939. The reason why they were trying to use appeasement was to try to avoid the World War from happening, but they failed.
Rena, how many weapons do you think they had? What were their weapons? What were their soldiers like?
To empathize with the reason for the beginning of World War II, Great Britain, France, and Poland had more people, soldiers, and military manpower than Germany. But Germany's army was really good at fighting because they had better weapons, training, and teamwork, which makes them the best fighters for their size. In September 1939, countries read their military strengths by counting how many groups of soldiers they could get ready to fight. Germany had a lot of with 100 groups of foot soldiers and 6 groups of tank soldiers. France had 90 groups of foot soldiers and Great Britain had 10 groups of foot soldiers. Poland had 300 groups of soldiers, 12 groups of horse soldiers, and 1 group of tank soldiers. Each group had been 12K to 20K soldiers in it. 2 days after the German invasion of Poland on September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The firepower of German troops was way bigger than French, British, or Polish divisions. The average German division was equipped with 442 machine guns, 135 mortars, 72 anti-tank guns, and 24 cannons. In September 1939, Germany had 6 of these special groups, even though the Allies had many infantry. The power was only a little bit stronger than what they had during World War I. Theodore, can you tell us what infantry is?
An infantry is moved by trucks and foot soldiers, followed by German tank divisions with deep moves into enemy territory. The German tanks were used in gathered formations with motorized weapons to puncture holes in the enemy line and isolate enemy areas. These areas were surrounded and captured by motorized German infantry divisions while the tanks moved forward to repeat the process. In order to further impair the enemy's defensive power, dive bombers struck and destroyed the enemy's supply and communication lines, causing confusion and fear in the rear. The secret to the German Blitzkrieg, which is often known as the Lightning War, which got its name from its deadly speed and mobility. The German tanks divisions were a force unlike any other in Europe, having been trying to test and having received intensive maneuver training. Rearmament is basically about Germany rebuilding their military, even though they're not supposed to because of the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies chose to ignore this violation.
Can you talk about the invasion of Ethiopia?
One of the first Western invasion happened when one of the few independent nations in European-dominated Africa, Ethiopia in 1934, was invaded by Italy. That December, Benito Mussolini used a border dispute between Ethiopia and Italian Somaliland as reason for his intervention. The real reason was to join the two Italian colonies to the north and south of Ethiopia together and provide a base for an invasion of British held Egypt. On October 3, 1935, the Italians invaded Ethiopia, rejecting all offers of justice. A decisive victory in Lake Ashangi on April 9, 1936, and the capture of the city Addis Ababa on May 5, 1936, were achieved by the invaders as they gradually forced back to poorly equipped and prepared Ethiopian army. Though the fighting was tougher than expected and sapped Italy's already limited resources, forcing them to rely more on the Germany. The Emperor of Ethiopia, the head of the country, fled. The king of Italy was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia in Rome by the director. Rena, what happened during their League of Nations?
One of the first Western invasion, the League of Nations decided to put cash penalties on their invader after criticizing in 1935 the Italians' invasion in response to Ethiopia's request. Due to widespread lack of support, penalties continued to be unsuccessful. The other great nations had little interest in confronting Mussolini, despite the fact that the British, who had a stake in East Africa, disapproved of their aggression. Global tensions between the extreme right and the Western democracies were made worse by the war, which gave the Italian Empire claims for more weight. Eventually, Italy and Germany would leave the League over objections to their actions. Most nations had little interest in upholding the decision of the League.
Rena, you can go ahead and talk about Poland.
The book Mein Kampf, written long before Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, outlined his rude, racially motivated outlook. According to him, Germany should have won World War I, but the infamous Treaty of Versailles reduced it when Jews and communists stabbed it in the back. For Germans to realize their destiny as the master race, life space or living space is necessary. According to him, Germany's future relied on gaining more territory. Hitler had successfully taken Austria, the Sudetenland, and eventually all of Czechoslovakia. By the summer of 1939, without firing a shot, Poland was next. Hitler pulled out of the London Naval Agreement and Non-Violence Pact with Poland on April 28. He also found out that the British and French negotiations to reach a non-aggression pact with the Soviets had failed. Hitler took the opportunity to strike a peace treaty with Stalin. Despite his hatred for the Bolsheviks, which would allow him to fight Poland without running the risk of two-front war with the West or having to deal with Soviet interference in the East. As a result, the August 23 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was hurriedly signed in order for Hitler to get it prior to his intended invasion of Poland. The most famous one was the planned assault on a radio station in Gleiwitz, which is located on the German-Polish border. On the evening of August 31, 1939, a German farmer from Silesia was shot, drugged, and arrested by the Nazis for his own Polish support. The Germans left the body as evidence that Poles had taken over the station and took control. The entire thing was a fiction, but soon Joseph's publicity machine was producing tales of the horrific assault. The event was already being used by Hitler to support his invasion of Poland. By morning of September 1, 1939. Poland's destiny was sealed shortly afterward by the attack of Worcester Plate. The battle was unfair from the start. For the attack, the Germans had gathered an army of 9,000 cannons, 2,750 tanks, 2,315 aircrafts, and 1.5 million troops. Although the Poles had a potential army of 1 million troops, many of them were unable to mobilize, and those who did had much less of it. Only 4,300 weapons, 210 tanks, 678 tanks, and 808 aircrafts, and the old-fashioned equipment. In order to protect themselves from German attacks, the Poles planned to gather their force in the west and wait for the British and French, with whom they had formed a military alliance on March 31, to launch an attack on Germany from the west. To make matters worse, the Germans developed a new tactic, or war of movement, which had later been known as Blitzkrieg, that was to be fatal for the Poles thanks to the general. Tank divisions backed by the Luftwaffe were supposed to charge forward and overcome German defense, shocking the enemy with their strength and speed. The tanks would then be able to move forward once more as non-mechanized forces advance. The introduction of the mess provision, which enabled soldiers to battle for days without rest, was one of the many innovations that the Germans relied on. Theodore, talk about the invasion of Norway and Denmark.
While Britain and France argued about how to protect Norwegian resources, Germany struck to secure for themselves. In 1940, on April 9, was when Germany's army soldiers took control of the main Norwegian ports from also north of Narvik, which is 1,200 miles from Germany's naval bases. At the same time, one parachute troop took the airfield at also in Stavanger. At the Norwegian people were taken over by the 800 flying aircraft. Norwegian resistance in Stavanger and Narvik. Germany troops from the airfield invaded the city, eliminating Elso's strong resistance to the seaborne forces, which had already been beaten down at Bergen, Stavanger, and Kristiansand. Planes, troop ships entered Copenhagen port city on April 9 and developed across the land border into Jutland as part of the invasion of Denmark. Surely this invasion was required to ensure the security of their communications with Norway.
Theodore, what was it like when the Germans invaded the Netherlands?
Dutch witnesses reported seeing Germany Luftwaffe bombers heading towards the North Sea early on May 10, 1940. They thought they were headed for England. The bombers turned 180 degrees and went back to attack the Netherlands after they were over sea. There was war in the Netherlands. Hitler attempted to change public opinion by using a lie to defend the attack. He stated that France and England had been preparing to strike the German Ruhr area through Belgium and the Netherlands. As a result, some German soldiers were taken away when they never saw any English forces in the Netherlands. In the south, the German soldiers also launched a military assault on the Netherlands. In order to prevent the German assault, Dutch troops destroyed bridges there. It wasn't always this way. Wearing Dutch clothes, Wehrmacht force overran the Dutch soldiers in order to seize the strategically important Genep railway bridge. The Dutch army resisted the German army for 3 days on the Grebbebrug. The defensive line was primarily made up on flooded ground. For a while, it caused the invader to slow down. The Greb line nevertheless collapsed on May 13. In contrast to popular belief, the German invasion was not entirely unexpected. Although the Netherlands was ready for war, its neutralist stance stood in the way. It stopped France and England from working together on a suitable defense plan. The Dutch army's condition was not as bad as is frequently said, but their weapons were old and weak, plus the Netherlands missed Germany's strong military heritage. Nevertheless, the Dutch launched some operational military strike. Sadly, the army management often failed to provide the overview and was unable to turn minor wins into major accomplishments. Rena, tell us about the U.S. response to World War II.
Even though it did not officially enter the war until December 1941, the United States started to give the Allies major military supplies and other support in September 1940. Using a new policy called Lend-Lease, a large portion of this equipment went to the United Kingdom and other countries already at war with Germany and Japan. President Franklin Roosevelt stated that although the U.S. would maintain its legal neutrality, he could not ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. When war broke out in Europe in September 1939, Roosevelt himself worked hard to support countries fighting Nazi Germany and wished to assist those that lacked and the resources needed to fight the Germans. Because it lacked the hard currency to pay for the food, raw materials, and military supplies it required from the United States. The United Kingdom in particular was in need of assistance due to the submarine warfare by the Germans. When the Soviet Union was invaded, the United States poured billions in food, fuel, and munitions to keep them fighting as the German advanced.
Let's talk about invasion of France and then the operation of Barbarossa.
During World War II, the German invasion of Low Countries and France in just over 6 weeks, German armed forces invaded Belgium and Netherlands, drove the British Expeditionary Force from the continent lieutenant captured Paris and forced the surrender of the French government. By early June 1940, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands had fallen. The British had been driven into the sea, and the Germans had taken more than 1 million Allied prisoners in the space of 3 weeks. On June 5, 1940, during middle of the night at 4 a.m., the German offensive was launched. At first, it started with the western stretch between Loen and the Channel, with a barrage of dive bombers and a powerful thrust of mechanized and armored troops. It was soon evident that the immediate German objective was the main capture of Paris, but the wholesale knocking down of the remaining French armies in the field. What was Renaud's choice with the loss of Paris?
Renaud responded to the loss of Paris by relocating the government from Tours to Bordeaux, as Tours was on the new French defensive line on the Loire. Renaud issued an appeal: "Today, the life of France is a stake. Our fight, each day more painful, has no further sense if in continuing we do not see even far away the hope of a common victory growing. Policy of Nazi German that involved expanding German territories to the east to provide land and material resources for the German people, while driving out Jewish and Slavic people."
The last thing we are going to talk about is Operation of Barbarossa.
Hitler was writing a book called Mein Kampf, in which he defined his belief in the dominance of the Aryan race and in the German destiny for world domination, inclusion to economic motives. Lebensraum had a racist component. Hitler likened Lebensraum to the American notion of manifest destiny. For him, the Slavic and Jewish residents of the East were subhumans, whom he identified with Native Americans. Hitler also hated Marxist Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union, whom he considered to be in the league with Jews. Hitler's plans for the Soviet Union include creating a starvation in Eastern Europe to depopulate the region.
Let's talk about the background of Operation Barbarossa.
As World War II entered its second year, Adolf Hitler's strongest emotional belief remained anti-communism, despite his self-congratulation on the German-Soviet non-aggression pact of 1939. As a matter of economy, Hitler's long-standing desire to bring down the Soviet government was heightened in June 1940 when Soviet forces invaded the Baltic state, Bessarabia, and northern Bukovina, putting Soviet forces close to the Romanian oil field that Germany relied on. Hitler and his general had planned to invade the Soviet Union in mid-May 1941, but they were forced to postpone the Soviet campaign until late June due to the unexpected need to invade Greece and Yugoslavia in April of the same year. Let's talk about the initial offense that happened in Operation Barbarossa.
On June 22, 1941, the German offensive was launched by 3 army groups under the same leaders as the invasion of France in 1940. The Soviet leadership was caught entirely off guard by the invasion along a 1,800-mile right away, leaving the Red Army completely released and unprepared. Gruger's tanks raced 50 miles past the border on the first day of the invasion as part of Bach's group's southern flank on June 27. They arrived at Minsk 200 miles beyond the border. The Germans were only 200 miles from Moscow by the middle of July, a distance of more than 400 miles. The main reason they lost the chance was because Hitler and the OKH argued all through August on where the followed pushes should go from there. They still had plenty of time to make major advances before winter arrived. Eventually, Hitler overrode his generals and made the fateful decision to send German armies towards Stalingrad instead of continuing to advance on the capital Moscow. Thus, during Stalingrad, the German armies would encircle and over 1 million Germans would be killed or captured. This would be the beginning of the end for German aggression in Europe, and tide would slowly turn towards the Allies. Now that we talked about everything, we should jump to the conclusion.
Just to recap about the beginning of war, this deadly war affected so much that people were losing many family members, and I wonder what the world would be like at this time right now if the beginning of war never happened, right? Like, what if the whole world helped each other instead of fighting each other and being more responsive with others by sharing or trading without having to argue or start a war about it? Things would have been more different today if World War I and II never started. Another thing about blitzkrieg can be applied to non-military contexts, like in basketball. It can be related to basketball, like trying to be fast by being ahead of your opponent or beating them to defense or offense. Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you like this podcast, go check Jack Badkey for more podcasts like this. You can share this podcast with others if you really liked it. Talk to you guys later. Come back to listen to more history, facts, and stories.